Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to Rocket Summer 2025, Michael K. Vaughan's great BookTube event where we read classic science fiction in the month of July when it's nice and hot in the northern hemisphere. It really lends itself to sci-fi. Uh, and with BookTube events just in general, and with this one in specific, BookTube events tend with me to want to have a mind of their own. They tend to want to set their own course and go in that direction and drag me along. And that looked like it was going to happen for the beginning of Rocket Summer anyway. It looked like I was going to be reading lots and lots of Edgar Rice Burroughs, which certainly doesn't get any objection from me. But most of Edgar Rice Burroughs that is not Carson of Venus or John Carter of Mars, most of it that isn't that is only borderline science fiction. So I intentionally wrenched myself out of that pattern last night. Instead, I read this, Wanderers of Time by John Wyndham, writing as John Benyon, and this is the author of The Chrysalids, The Day of the Triffids, Midwich Cuckoos. So he wrote science fiction books that are immortal. He wrote books that a lot of science fiction people have read, and maybe even when it comes to The Day of the Triffids, maybe a lot of non-science fiction people. But this is a coronet paperback from the 1970s. Yeah, 1973, which would put it outside the range of Rocket Summer. But all the stories in here are from the 30s. This is just repackaged with a coronet cover. So I figured it was fair game. The 1930s is the what we want for the first week in Rocket Summer. We want the very earliest years of science fiction, and this was very early years. This was long before satellites, long before lunar probes, long before extraplanetary probes of any kind. So what you had to go on here was speculation, mainly done by H.G. Wells and maybe a little Jules Verne, and also scientists. There were lots and lots of scientists who were speculating. In fact, the person who writes the introduction here, the introduction is by Walter Gillings, and he writes, in the days before the world had heard of Werner von Braun or Konstantin Tsiolkovsky. Konstantin Tsiolkovsky is such a fascinating figure in Russian science. Such a fascinating, visionary figure. I wouldn't have wanted to be in the same room with him. I think he probably stank to high heaven, but he is amazing. And his books are amazing to read. The concept of space travel was derided by all but the readers and writers of science fiction. To John Benyon, the notion was part of his stock and trade, which he replenished by listening to the debates of the British Interplanetary Society, then a mere handful of enthusiasts. And that isn't true. I don't mean to start arguments here, but that isn't true. The idea of interplanetary travel was not derided except by science fiction readers and writers. There are plenty of people who thought and dreamt about it in the 1920s and the 1930s. In the 1920s and the 1930s, even when Wyndham was writing these stories, the idea was exact homogeneity. So space travel was homologous. No one had really thought of the opposite of that at all. So the idea was, well, if there's another world, like the moon or Mars or Venus, then it will have weather like ours, skies like ours, people, many different species like ours. They will have concerns like ours. We will be able to go there and walk around in our shirt sleeves. It was only, as I've mentioned with Rocket Summer, it was only gradually, over decades of research and expanding the scientific frontier, that we realized that all the other worlds in this solar system are dead. Not only dead, but deadly, lethal to organic life as we know it, to organic life that needs cell walls. But these stories were written before that was true. And here, in these stories, there are 5 stories in this book. There is Wanderers of Time, Derelicts of Space, Child of Power, The Last Lunarians, and The Puffball Menace. And most of those stories follow, generally speaking, the thought patterns of H.G. Wells or Jules Verne, mostly H.G. Wells. So with The Last Lunarians, you have a trip to the moon. With Derelicts of Space is really, really good. It takes space travel for granted, and you can see Wyndham trying to work out, well, how would that be? How would that actually work? And I had never read any of these stories before, and reading Derelict of Space, I caught myself like halfway through the story, and I had to remind myself of when it was written, which is amazing. I mean, that's an unfair burden to put on a science fiction author, that they be such a visionary of the future that they write a realistic story of a time that's, a whole generation away. I don't put that burden on writers at all. I'm perfectly happy to read a Robert Heinlein story where he thinks that ships will get to the moon by using gigantic rubber bands. Put a gigantic rubber band between two mountain peaks, stretch it back as far as you can, and then let it go and hurl the rocket to the moon that way. I don't have any objection to reading anything like that. But nevertheless, it really did stick out. But my favorite story in here is Child of Power, which is about a weird boy. It's about a boy who develops superpowers. And that was fascinating. It was done with a lot of heart, a lot of empathy. And it was, again, I was reading the story and I had to remind myself that this takes place long before the stories that we think of when we think of young boys getting superpowers. Long before Superman, for instance. But also long before Flowers for Algernon or Ender's Game, or even this author's own. He wrote a book called Chalky that I have read, and it is a favorite among John Wyndham readers. John Wyndham's never really done it for me. Not completely, and even now not. But Chalky is very similar to Child. It seems to me that in these stories, like the Puffball Menace, definitely looks forward to the Day of the Triffids. I think you can see in these stories Wyndham working out some of the thematic preoccupations that he would later really flesh out with his more successful novels. And he's a very good writer. He's very intelligent. He shapes a good sentence. He can almost successfully disguise when he's writing filler. Every one of these stories has such an amount of filler in it. Oh my god. To the point where I read all of them at once. I read the whole book from front to back, as opposed to reading just one story at a time. If you read them one after another, you can really start to spot the filler. You can start to spot when Wyndham has he has a story and he has one idea, one crucial idea. And that idea would realistically take a page to write. So you've got to flesh it out. And there are ways to do that, and there are ways to do that. Some writers are better than others at doing that. And all of his writing attributes that I have read in his books, I read Chalky, I read Chrysalis, I read The Day of the Triffids, I read The Midwich Cuckoos. I've had all of those in mass market paperbacks, one kind or another. And they all just struck me as sort of being there. They didn't strike me as having much of the fire that I want in a science fiction story. The fire of boundary pushing or frontier exploring, even if it's just an idea. That these didn't really have that for me. These stories, Child of Power came the closest, I thought, and only because it was the most personal. The other stories didn't really. I'm not saying Wyndham has to insert himself into the story, but you can still tell when an author is personally involved, or whether or not they're. I don't even know. I don't know what it would be that he was doing in the 1930s, before there was a market for science fiction in the commercial sense that we understand it today, and that would quickly become true in the 40s and 50s. I'm not sure what he was doing. I gather that, from what little I remember, that there were venues. Maybe that was all there was. Maybe it was just that there was a venue, so he knew he could get a paycheck. I know that it's heresy to say I read John Wyndham, and even early John Wyndham, and he made me pine for Edgar Rice Burroughs. But that fire, I'm not saying that Edgar Rice Burroughs doesn't have filler, but that fire that I'm talking about, where the writer really likes the story, wants to tell it to you, you never don't have that with Edgar Rice Burroughs. And I didn't notice it much here. Derelict in Space had it for a bit, one particular subplot of Derelict in Space. Child of Power had it very much so, especially in the persona of the child's parents. I myself, I have said many times before in Rocket Summer videos and outside of Rocket Summer videos that science fiction had a unique challenge something that no other genre has had. If you are Lovecraft or Lovecraftian, if you are writing in the horror genre, well, you can obviously just go right on doing that, right? Stephen King has made a big career. You can go right on doing that because the whole point of horror is that the things that go bump in the night are not susceptible to an advance in knowledge. They are always going to be there. There will always be monsters in the closet. And if you're writing murder mysteries, well, it's a challenge. You have to get more creative as technology improves. So if you're writing a murder mystery set in an English village in Edwardian times, your detective or your private investigator is going to have a lot of common sense, a lot of knowledge of how the human mind works, maybe a lot of knowledge of the locus and quo, the village and the people and whatnot, but they're not going to have any knowledge or ability to do DNA sampling. Maybe even if you go back far enough to do fingerprints. In any realistic sense of the word, there won't be any fingerprint database. There won't be any surveillance cameras. There won't be anything like that. There won't be anything like that. But as those things come along, people are still going to kill people. They're still going to try to hide it. So all you need to do is get more inventive. Or take the coward's way out and set your story before that technology exists. But you more than likely are going to just get more creative. It's not going to present an existential challenge to your genre. Whereas science fiction? No, it's science fiction. It's fundamentally different. It's an existential difference. Wyndham was writing at a time when we did not know the moon was lifeless. He was writing at a time when we did not know that Mars and Venus are lifeless, and probably always have been. Certainly have been for any length of time where humans were involved. The writers at this time were writing when we didn't know what we now do know. And no matter how clever you are, you can't get around the fact that there are no monster-inhabited equatorial jungles on Venus. No amount of cleverness is going to allow those to be there. They aren't there. They never were there. Certainly not at any time for our humans to go there. There may have been a time millions of years ago when if you'd looked up in the sky with a handheld telescope, you would have seen that Mars and Venus were both blue water planets. But it was a long time ago. You would have to time travel. There's a time travel story in here. You would have to time travel in order to see that. And it hasn't been true in a long time. And we now know that. So any story that takes you to the Lunarians and tells you about a civilization on the moon, well, that's different. Reading that story now is different from reading a story written in Edwardian England about a whodunit murder mystery. It's different. You can read that story about the Edwardian whodunit with unabated enjoyment. No part of your brain needs to recalculate except just the part that you're accustomed to. Your brain is accustomed to recalculating, but when technology appeared, certain technologies appeared. Your brain does that easily, automatically, when you talk to your decrepit old grandparents who come from a time before technology, as far as you're concerned, certainly before the internet and social media. So when you encounter an old story like that, a Carson of Venus story, you can just say, oh, well, they didn't know. So I can slide my allowance for that. I can just say, okay, well, they didn't know. And I had to do that with these stories. Except Child of Power. I had to do that with these stories, and sometimes it worked better than others. I think that if you have that kind of fire that I'm talking about, that kind of narrative involvement with what you're doing, it overrides the knowledge deficit. And I don't know that John Wyndham did in these stories, and the heresy here, of course, would be I don't know that he ever did. No offense to you people who love Day of the Triffids, that's all. But so I don't know, my Rocket Summer essay last night was... It was the corrective that I wanted. I didn't want to just read Edgar Rice Burroughs all month long, but boy, oh boy, was it not as enjoyable as Edgar Rice Burroughs. So who knows what tonight. I will go exploring my bookshelves. I love that. I love exploring the bookshelves for BookTube events. So I'll go exploring and see what I can find tonight, and I will see you tomorrow with my results. Thank you, BookTube.